Brainstorming questions are traditionally something candidates have struggled with. Even with our own clients, it really, I think, is something that I get concerned about when we spend a lot of time teaching clients how to brainstorm. And the issue is not that they just don't know how to brainstorm. They do struggle with that, but they just refuse to do it in a case. So it's one thing about trying to do it. It's another thing about completely forgetting to do it. And I always point out to candidates that if you can learn how to brainstorm, you'll never have to memorize a framework for the rest of your life. So imagine how easy that makes cases for you. But secondly, if you have to learn how to brainstorm, you can also go in confident that no matter what happens in a case, no matter how difficult a situation is, you will always be able to brainstorm your way out of that. Now, we cover brainstorming in quite a lot of detail in our session 4 training, but I decided to put up this video on brainstorming because it's one of those fundamental areas that I just don't think people are understanding and committing to and using. So I'm going to use the BMW brainstorming case to get people to understand and get clients to understand how to brainstorm. The first thing about a brainstorming case is that I'm going to first talk you through how to solve this case, and then I'm going to maybe decompose the approach to give some pointers in terms of how it could be done, right? Now, the first step of a brainstorming case is that a candidate should always understand the definition of what it is they are brainstorming, right? So step 1 is definition. Whatever it is you are brainstorming, if you don't know the definition, you will not be able to brainstorm it, period. Always define. In this case, you need to define productivity. There's only one definition for productivity. I do believe in doing this case with candidates, I've received a different definition with every single candidate I've done the case. So the definition for productivity would be the total value of outputs over the total input costs, right? And you should share this definition with your interviewer. Right? So first I'm going to talk through the mechanics of the case, and then I will verbalize it the way I've done it in the case. So I want you to see how we solve it. Firstly, see behind the scenes. Then, so let me just write down the steps of how we're going to do. So one is, first I'm going to do sort of the behind the scenes here. So you can see how I do things and why I do it. 2, I'm going to verbalize this. Right? So people can see how I would speak through it in a case. And 3, I'm going to look at some considerations, some important things you need to know about a brainstorming case. So you look at the definition. Now the definition can give you the structure, right? So what you've got to do is step 2 is you've got to look at direct drivers. The reason I have to say direct drivers is people always put in indirect drivers, like they'll say something like the total value of inputs is driven by the state of the world economy. This is not a direct driver. The total value of inputs is driven by 2 things, or maybe 3 things actually. It is directly driven by the number of units of cars produced, the price of a unit, and the portfolio mix of units, right? So number of units is quite straightforward. Let's assume it's something like 3 million cars. Price per unit, let's assume, is something like $35,000. Portfolio mix of units, well, this is your portfolio as a pie chart. You can produce 25% 3 series and 75% 7 series. Or you can flip them around. The portfolio choice will obviously determine the average price per car and also the unit capacity that is produced. So portfolio mix, the unit allocation across the portfolio, that gives you the drivers. The direct drivers of costs would be obviously fixed and variable, right? Now, this comes to my third lesson. Third lesson is you must build a decision tree. If you can't see a decision tree like this, in your head when you're doing a brainstorming case, you're most likely doing it wrong. What a lot of candidates do is they will write down productivity and they'll brainstorm. Well, productivity is driven by labor, it's driven by cost, it's driven by demand, it's driven by prices, it's driven by material, it's driven by fuel. If you get what is called a hub and spoke, can you see why this is a hub and spoke? You've got a little hub in the middle here and everything's coming off like a spoke. If your decision tree looks like a hub and spoke, it's wrong because you haven't determined the prioritization of the drivers. If everything is a first level driver, you can see this is first level because it directly links to the question. This is first. If everything's a first level driver, then obviously you've not prioritized your case. And if things are not prioritized, well, consultants are not interested in what you're doing. Everything must be about priorities and building out the right structure, right? So let's go back and build this out even further. Now what I'm going to do here is that I'm going to apply the Macy rule. Is this MECE? Is there anything else, or is this collectively exhaustive firstly? So is there anything else here required to generate value? No. Is there anything else here required to generate cost? No. So CE part is met. Are they mutually exclusive? Can you change the units independently of price and portfolio? Yeah, you could. Could you change the price independently of units and portfolio? You could. Can you change the portfolio mix independent of the number of units and price? You could. You could always produce 3 million cars, but just change which 3 million cars you produce. Can you change fixed prices without changing variable prices? You can. Sorry, variable costs. Can you change variable costs without changing fixed costs? You can. Now what you need to do is once you've drawn this out, you want to be efficient, right? When you're listing these things, so for example, when you're starting off by talking about value, be efficient. Start with the most important one. Start with that being the most important, then that, then that. Same here. Which is the biggest one? Probably fixed costs. So start with fixed costs, then go into variable costs. It really upsets me when people, when they're brainstorming, they'll start with the most irrelevant driver, and then when I tell them, well, actually that's wrong, this is what you need to look at, they'll tell me, hey, yeah, Michael, I'm going to get there. Well, I'm not interested if you're going to get there in 5 minutes. You know, time is money. I bill at about $1,000 an hour with corporate clients. So if you don't want to get there soon, you're wasting quite a lot of my time. It's the same with a client in a consulting environment. As a partner is building a lot of money, you know. You're wasting my time if you do this. Time is money. Start with the most important thing. And as well here, I would always tell the interviewer, well, what I'm going to do is I'm going to prioritize this. That's the 80-20 rule. I believe that price, unit allocation, and fixed costs are the most important, so I'm going to start there. I'd start down and look at what drives these. I'll say fixed cost is probably driven by labor, material, depreciation, land and buildings and so on. Units, number of units of cars produced is probably driven by demand and our supply capabilities. Price is probably driven by 4 things. It's driven by the unit cost of production. It's driven by the market price that the market is willing to bear. It's driven by competitors. And it's driven by our strategy. Now you can see this is the first level of my decision tree. That's probably 1 here, 2, 3. Once I get to the third level, I'll then look at how I can manipulate this decision tree. So I'll say, okay, again, I'll prioritize. I'll say the most important thing here is probably, let's say, demand. Pricing is most carefully driven by unit costs and competition. And probably labor is going to be huge, and materials. Then I'll say, okay, I think we can manipulate demand by changing our ad campaign and by going for lower price cars. I believe we can change our unit cost of production by going to low cost centers. I believe we can change our labor costs, again low cost. I believe we can maybe launch a newer series below the 3 series to capture more of the luxury market, right? So lower version car. I think I wrote lower version car. And material, I think we can probably sourcing agreements in place. Now this is the mechanics of how things are going to work, right? This is behind the scenes. Now let me talk you through the way I would do it. It's one thing to know what to do, it's another thing to talk it through. So let's assume the interviewer asks you, hey Michael, so let's just start off with the kickstart the case interviews. I would like you to brainstorm for me how BMW should increase its productivity. I'll say, well, thank you. That's a very interesting question. I just bought myself a BMW, so I think the cars are very exceptional, but I can understand, you're dealing with this from a corporate perspective. So I'm going to make that assumption. I think to start, I'm going to assume that productivity is the total value of outputs divided by the total cost of inputs to produce those outputs, so that we're on the same page. So let's just think about this, right? Let's look at the drivers of outputs, and then I'll independently look at the drivers of cost. The drivers of output, I think outputs are driven by three things in order of rough importance. I think it is directly driven by the units of cars you produce. It is directly driven by the price per unit, and it's directly driven by the portfolio mix of cars we produce. And that'll be the third driver. And for portfolio mix, what I'm really referring to is whether we choose to produce 25% cheaper cars, 75% more expensive cars like the 7 Series and so on. So that's the first area. I think that the outputs we could do a lot in, but let me go through the direct drivers of cost. I think the direct drivers of cost are easy. There's fixed costs as the first direct driver. The second direct driver is variable costs. Now outside of these, now looking at these five branches I've put together, I'm going to prioritize it. I think the most important ones under value would be the units of production and the price, and under cost it will be fixed costs. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to further break those down, and I can always come back and break down the others if you feel that they may be more important. So under units of production, I think there are two direct drivers. I think the demand in the market drives the units of production we obviously produce, and obviously supply is our ability to produce. I mean, we may very well have a strong demand, but if we don't have supply capacity, we're not going to produce enough cars. And I think between those two, demand is the most important one, so that's the one I'll analyze further. For prices of units, I think prices is driven by the unit cost of production. The price the market is willing to bear would probably be second. Third would be what competitors want to pay, and then finally the strategy we have. But I think I want to change that a little bit. I think that within prices, I think the unit cost of production is most important, and what competitors are charging in the market would be the other big drivers. So those are the two I'd analyze, and I would ignore the other two for now. But I could exploit if you want me to. And the fixed cost, I think we have labor, probably the most important, material probably second, depreciation third. And I want to explore labor and material. So now I've brainstormed my way out quite extensively into the case. What I want to do now is I'm going to look at how we can manipulate those drivers which have the greatest sensitivity on driving productivity. So, we said that demand, I think to increase demand, we can maybe increase our advertising campaign, or we can lower the price of the car. That could also obviously drive demand as well. Unit cost of production, I think the only thing we could probably do there is get economies of scale, or we can go to a low-cost country to produce cars. In terms of competition, one of the things I was thinking about is to increase demand. Maybe we could introduce a variant of the BMW below the 3 Series, because I think there's quite a hotly contested space. So it's not to introduce a car that's very poor quality, but to introduce a very high quality car below the 3 Series level. In terms of labor, again, I think we can either reduce the amount of laborers we have, or change their employment contracts, or if that doesn't work, we can even go to a low-cost center. In terms of material, I think we look at sourcing agreements. So that's how I would tackle this case. Now, if you have any questions, I'm happy to answer them, or if you think I should analyze the areas I haven't analyzed, I'd be happy to talk through that as well. So just see the difference between how you break it down. You notice that when I broke it down, I was sort of stumbling through to explain things to you. But when you speak it through, you have to be quite eloquent. And a lot of this has to be done in your head, right? You don't have time to write this down. In most brainstorming cases, you have to be able to do this in your head. You have to say, okay, first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to look at the definition. Then you have to brainstorm your first set of direct drivers, prioritize them. Then your second set of direct drivers, prioritize them. And then for the prioritized branches, so let me repeat that, right? Just to make sure everyone's on the same page, I'll use green. First step is you've got to go with your definition. You're doing this all in your head. Second, then you have to look at the direct drivers, right? So that's these. Then you have to prioritize your direct drivers. For your prioritized direct drivers, you have to then break out their drivers. Then you have to prioritize those drivers. And then for those prioritized drivers, you have to explain how you would manipulate them to increase the total productivity. So let's look at some of the very important considerations here, right? I'm going to probably use a different color here to make it easier to see. and maybe a different size as well. The first thing you have to understand in a brainstorming case is that no prompts are given. Yes, sometimes you are told brainstorm this, but in 90% of situations where you need to brainstorm, you are not told brainstorm. So I think what a candidate has to realize is that brainstorming must be second nature to you. If it's not second nature to you, it's not going to be natural for you to want to brainstorm in a case. And I've yet to see a candidate who naturally brainstorms. I've seen all of them struggling, and we've got to guide them and push them in this direction. So the first thing is, remember, no prompts are given. Types of decision trees. Remember, you get many different types of decision trees. I'm just going to scroll down a little bit here to be able to draw this out. You have decision tree 1, where you have, let's say, how can you go to the market? You can walk, you can drive, or you can run there. Do you notice they're all mutually exclusive? You can either walk, or drive, or run. You can only pick one at a time. You cannot pick more than one. Another kind of decision tree is revenue minus costs equals profits. Now here, for a company to increase its profits, it could increase its revenue and reduce its costs, right? Another kind of decision tree is a yes and a no decision tree. It's similar to this one here, but here you only have two branches, yes and no. The other kind of decision tree is what is known as cascading decision tree. It's very uncommon. It's where you are going to have to follow a set path from top to bottom, like something like should you do something, could you do it, would you do it if you could do it and you should do it. Very uncommon. I wouldn't recommend using that. Now when you build your decision tree, you have to decide which types of branches do you want to use. Do you want to use that kind? Do you want to use that kind, or do you want to use that kind? If you use this kind for level 1, are you going to use this kind for level 2? You could do that. It's also fine. You can swap them and change them. So you want to be comfortable with the kind of options you have, right? Whenever you are stuck in the case, the first thing you want to do is brainstorm. Brainstorming must come as your default mechanism, right? Simple. The kind of brainstorming that you generate, these branches that you generate here, they allow me to test your business judgment. Now, candidates always tell me, Michael, you know what, I've got a week to go, but I'm really weak at making estimates and brainstorming. How do I improve that? What can I do in a week? And I tell them you can't do anything in a week. Postpone your interview. If you've got a month, it can definitely be done. If you have a week to pull this off, not going to be possible. It's like winning a math award in high school. You don't win a math award by just cramming for a week. You will have had to have known the basics over many years and then have learned how to apply it in the final week. Cases are a little bit like that. When it comes to making good business judgment and good assumptions and good brainstorming techniques, well, not technique, but good brainstorming branches, it's about what you've read previously, which you then draw on, right? Very important thing to remember is that you can actually make a case more easy or more difficult depending on whether you go with this kind of decision tree or this kind of decision tree here. So you have to pick very carefully the one you want to work with, right? Is it option A, option B? If you go with the wrong one, you can make the case much more difficult. Let's go back to this decision tree up here. There's another point to make. Do you notice that only when I get to level 1, level 2, only when I get to, sorry, that's level 2, that's level 3. Only when I get to level 3 do I say this is what we could do. Do you notice my language is always, it is driven by. By using that language, it forces my brain to think of the direct drivers. As soon as someone stops using the language driven by, I know they're going to make a mistake. Now that's assuming you are using this kind of drivers here. When you're developing options, saying it's driven by options doesn't actually sound good. When you're using this kind of decision tree structure, to say driven by makes a whole lot of sense. When you're using this kind of structure, you should say the company has these complete list of options available to itself. That way, you make sure you give the complete list of options. Again, I use the same language here, driven by, right? And only when I get here do you notice I say the company could do this. So you can see driven by is a fact. Driven by is a fact here. Could is speculation. I'm speculating. I only start speculating once I finish building my decision tree. Too many candidates, what they'll do is they will build out their first level of the decision tree, say this one they'll get right. Maybe this one they'll get right, but then they'll start speculating. You only speculate once you are sure your decision tree is finished. Remember that. No speculation, no we could do this, we should do this, until you are comfortable you finished your decision tree. Otherwise, you don't go into it. Consulting is all about prioritization. If you're not prioritizing your branches for analysis, don't do the case. Just tell the interviewer you're sorry for wasting their time. You will come back when you've learned how to do cases. If you cannot prioritize, you're wasting time. Don't start with unnecessary branches. Don't spend 5 minutes explaining an unnecessary branch when the most important branch is going to come up after 7 minutes. You've wasted 7 minutes of my time, right? You are always applying Macy's. MEC, as some people say, MEC, right? You have to apply it to know you've got the right branches and the fact that you've also separated them effectively. The other thing you want to remember is that you want to start with big buckets. You notice that when I started this case, I started with 2 big buckets. Value of inputs and total input cost. And then I broke the big buckets into smaller buckets. I find candidates going with this hub and spoke model. Lots of buckets up front. If you have a lot of buckets up front, you're most likely wrong. You should always start off with large buckets. McKinsey likes that. These are the large buckets that are driving the issue, right? Finally, I mentioned direct drivers. That language really helps you when you're using a certain kind of decision tree. And only use speculation language when you get to the end. Now, we're applying MECE and starting with the most important drivers. We're obviously applying the 80-20 rule. So you can see how the principles of MECE, 80-20, and brainstorming all fit together, right? If you know how to brainstorm, you will know how to develop hypotheses as well. For some reason, over the last 20 years, we've been led to believe that brainstorming and hypotheses are different. They are not different. The same way the first humans started in Africa and then the Japanese look different from the Africans doesn't mean they're different. The point is, if you watch the video on the McKinsey approach, you'll see how they are actually one and the same. It's just that for whatever reason, people have decided they are different and they teach them all and they learn them all differently. The point is they are very combined techniques. But you cannot do the hypothesis-based approach with any structure unless you learn how to brainstorm first. So what you need to do is understand this approach, right? And my advice to you is whenever you get stuck in a case, you should brainstorm. You should always brainstorm if you get stuck in a case. As always, I'll be more than happy to provide comments and feedback.